All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Matt Cropp. I'm Executive Director of the Vermont Employee Ownership Center, and pleased to be talking to you all today about employee ownership trusts. I'm going to provide a little bit of background in terms of what we're seeing in Vermont and why this is of interest to us. And then the core of the presentation will be Christina kind of digging into it. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to uh, throw them in the chat or the Q&A feature here. And yeah, before I get into a little bit of the background, Christina, you want to introduce yourself and organization?
Yeah, happy to do that. Thanks, Matt, again for having us. I'm Christina from Common Trust. So my organization specifically helps owners that are interested in transitioning their business to employee ownership, and more specifically, the Employee Ownership Trust. Um, so myself and my colleague Sergina are on today, and we'll leave our contact information either in the chat. It's also on the last slide, but like Matt said, just happy to answer questions live and make it interactive. So if you have anything for us, please let us know.
Great, great. So a little bit of background in terms of why our organization is interested in this and kind of what we're seeing. So the Vermont Employee Ownership Center, we're a nonprofit. We've been around since 2001, and our mission is to promote and foster broad-based employee ownership. And that can take a number of different forms. In the 12 years that I've been in the field, by far the two most common have been the employee stock ownership plan, the ESOP, and the worker cooperative, which each has their own unique characteristics. And as we talk to 30 to 40 new business owners every year who are thinking about ownership succession, there's always a few for whom they have strong interest in employee ownership, but neither of those models really sort of made sense for a variety of reasons. And so we've been kind of keeping an eye out. We're always keeping an eye out for kind of what are the other sort of options on the menu for employee ownership. And since the beginning of my work on this, the employee ownership trust thing has been a bit on my radar. As in the UK and parts of Europe, it's the dominant form of employee ownership. And there've been kind of work by some lawyers trying to translate it into American law. But it really feels like in the last few years, it's gone from something that's much more speculative to something that really feels like um, a viable and option where you're not totally inventing the wheel, because there's others who've gone before. This year, we attended the Purpose Trust Ownership Network conference, and it was really interesting to be part of those conversations as we try to get our hands around more exactly what this thing is, because it is still new. And one thing that you'll hear about in this presentation that connects to our work is this question of the employee ownership trust is this subset of this broader category of the perpetual purpose trust, which is this very flexible model. We in Vermont, we had our first company go perpetual purpose trust, concept two, at the beginning of 2025. And there's a small but growing cohort of companies that are actively working on this, and it sounds like this year we'll probably see our first employee ownership trust. So Christina will get a little bit into kind of what differentiates from their perspective an employee ownership trust from, other kinds of perpetual purpose trusts. But for us, it's still, I think, in the broader kind of employee ownership center world, it's a little bit of an open question, but in general, the idea is like, again, centering both where the profits go to workers and also, if in terms of governance rights, how they're distributed, oftentimes governance rights are being connected to employees. But, as with all the different kinds of employee ownership, this is a thing that's an ongoing conversation, and it's a very flexible structure. So we're curious to see how much, you know, just how different people design it because of that. So with that, I'll pass it over to Christina, and excited to sort of hear her presentation. And again, if you have questions or curiosities, throw them at us as we go.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, and Matt's of course a very good resource on all of these things. Feel like I could just stop talking now, and he summarized it up pretty good. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully everybody can see the presentation. Matt, just confirming you can see it. Okay, awesome. So Matt just kind of gave you a really good overview, I think, of both several different broad-based models and a little bit about the EOT specifically. I wanted to also offer and maybe contextualize the perspective that I have, with employee ownership. So, and what is employee ownership? So from my standpoint, it's actually more than just a transaction. It's really aligning performance, values, transparency, and recognition into a cohesive strategy. So it serves three major objectives. So for the employees participate in profit share as well as have an increased voice in the company. Using this as an ownership strategy, it helps align incentives across the workforce and creates shared accountability. And then for the owner specifically, this can be a liquidity solution as well. And so just knowing that there's an alternative to maybe a private equity sale or strategic buyer, which are traditional paths that owners learn about when selling, this is a competitive sale as well. Just because it's employee ownership, it doesn't need to be a concessionary sale. One of the quotes I have on here is just from a business owner that we helped transition, and I think it sort of sums up those points really well. So, like in the previous slide, like in Jeremy's quote, the benefits compound when employee ownership is part of the operating culture and not just a bolt-on. So employee ownership is not just values-based, but it's also performance-based. I've selected a few research-backed outcomes to demonstrate this point. So for the business, employee-owned businesses see 50% less bankruptcy rates than non-employee-owned businesses. They also experience increased resiliency and productivity gains. And then employees, they're benefiting from higher wages, increased net wealth. And then again, for the sellers, this is competitive pricing and liquidity solution. So when we're thinking about employee ownership, what we find really valuable is that it's really aligning all these different stakeholders' incentives in a very sustainable and durable way. So Matt kind of started a little bit to give you sort of where employee ownership trusts sort of originated and kind of where they sit today. Again, with the focus on EOTs or employee ownership trusts, I thought it'd be useful to give just a quick, very brief history on this. So EOTs originated in the UK with the hallmark John Lewis partnership. So the John Lewis Partners is a department store and chains and supermarkets. It's one of the earliest EOTs and created the foundation for the EOT model that we use today. Fast forwarding a bit, the next thing the UK government did was commission the Nuttall Review on employee ownership. So this was named after Graham Nuttall, who's an attorney and an independent advisor to the UK government on employee ownership. His task was to identify the barriers that were keeping more private companies from being employee owned. So the short of his report and the analysis was he identified that simplifying the ownership structure and creating policy to support EOTs would help them grow. Really no surprise there. Shortly after the commission review, a new policy was introduced that included incentives like capital gains tax relief, non-inheritance tax charge, income tax relief, things like that. I think there actually has been a recent update on some of this policy, but either way, this was a pretty monumental effort. So at the same time in 2014, sort of across the pond, the United States was also starting to enter into its EOT journey. So the first EOT was created by this planning and architecture interior design firm. They established 360 employees across 9 global offices. Just want to make a call out, sort of worth noting here that this is a very abbreviated history. I've left out some of the precursor EO initiatives in the United States, like ESOPs and co-ops. So this is really just on the EOTs. If we fast forward to more today, we now have the largest EOT in the US, Consumer Direct Care Network. It's a home healthcare organization. And with its EOT, created benefits for over 60,000 caregivers. As it happens, we were fortunate to participate and help with this transition. And then if we think about today, so what we're seeing today really is still a lot of growth with EOTs, both in the US and the UK. And in the United States, at least at the state level, we're starting to see and track some of the policy initiatives that support the growth and expansion of employee ownership, including EOTs. And if anybody's got questions, just shout them out or put them in the chat. Okay, so we went over kind of the history of this. What actually is an employee ownership trust? So Matt kind of teed this up as well. I'll just sort of reiterate here. An employee ownership trust is a form of a perpetual purpose trust. So despite what seems like the somewhat recent history of the EOTs, the PPT trust case law has actually been around since the early 2000s. So in this model, the trust beneficiary is not an individual. Instead, it's a purpose or a set of purposes. And so how it's adapted here for employee ownership is that those purposes are designed to benefit employees and protect long-term independence of the company. So said differently, in this model, the trust is a shareholder and not individual employees. So since an EOT is a form of a perpetual purpose trust, let's talk for a second about the PPT. I'll often get asked sort of what are the distinctions between the PPT and EOT. It's probably actually easier to start with how they're similar. Practically speaking, an EOT and a PPT are the same. So they're the same legal structure, utilize similar financing mechanisms. The ways in which they're different are why a company may prefer to identify with one term over the other. So with a PPT, purposes may include protection of the environment, care for pets, doing only B Corp acquisitions, really kind of focused on, I'd call it social or charitable causes. With the EOT, the purpose are centered around employees and the benefit to employees. So you can think profit sharing and governance. With the EOT, you're typically allocating the profits to profit share, whereas in the PPT, you may elect to allocate it to things like your social cause or mission. The governance of the PPT may also include individuals, again, kind of within that mission space or within the space that the organization serves. Whereas with an employee ownership trust, the governance is likely going to include employees of the company. So really, though, the EOT is actually just a colloquial term. The PPT and the EOT are quite similar in the transaction structure, and where they differ is just in their intended purpose or motivation. All right. So what distinguishes this model from others? So the history lesson taught us, right? Simplicity. One of the reasons that, business owners like this model is that it's what's called an unregulated trust. Generally, what that means is it's a lot simpler to both set up and then to administer ongoingly. For those that are familiar with the ESOP, one of the biggest differences here is that the ESOP is regulated under ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, whereas with the EOT, it's not. So it's not regulated by that. So if you are subject to ERISA regulation, this is going to increase administrative requirements, compliance, reporting, audits, a number of other things. And so conversely, with the EOT, this is actually not required because it's not regulated under ERISA. It is still governed by trust law, so there's that, but not ERISA. Another sort of distinction here is because the EOT doesn't actually have shareholders, there's no requirement for annual valuations of those shares, and there's not a requirement to buy back those shares when an individual leaves. This is known as the repurchase obligation. So with the repurchase obligation, for some companies, it can pose a bit of a financial constraint, especially if you've got a lot of rapid growth and increasing, share value. On the one hand, of course, it's really good for your employees to see that share price grow, but the trade-off then is, making sure that the company has enough cash to handle that repurchase. Another one of the big reasons that we hear from, our business owners about why they like this model is that the design of the trust itself is highly customizable and bespoke to their particular business. So one of the EOTs we collaborate with said it best in that the EOT is a one-size-fits-one model. So everything from, codifying your purpose, your values, your culture, your independence, your right to profit share, all of these things that are codified in the trust agreement, these are actually being defined by, the owner or that next set of leaders, not by an outside body. Same with participation and eligibility. All of these are really up to the discretion of the owner and are decided by Department of Labor criteria. And the last thing I'll kind of note here, and this is usually the starting point that I talk about when people are looking at different models. So we'll use the term active profit sharing. So one of the things with an ESOP, so the value here is in the form of a share, and that share value grows over time, but is primarily only accessible at like a qualifying event like retirement. With the EOT and the profit share plan, this can really be designed around reaching targets or milestones, kind of making that profit share more tangible and in real time for the employees. So with an EOT, the owner can create, different benefit tiers, different profit tiers based on criteria that they define. So it could be things like tenure, it could be seniority, but they also could have a key leader pool that has sort of an outsized benefit, rewarding maybe their next gen leadership at a different rate. And so again, that speaks to both the customization, but I think also the more sort of real-time access to some of this profit share. So I think the kind of takeaways I would have here, EOTs appeals to owners that, want simplicity, want flexibility, and want long-term independence. So this is and by the way, I should have said this at the onset, this presentation is going to be shared with you guys, so no need to take, tons of notes or take a bunch of screenshots. You'll get this. But this is a summary table of a lot of the information I already discussed on the previous slide. One of the things I just want to acknowledge here is that, ESOPs are very powerful and a proven structure. And so, what I'm not trying to imply here is that one model is better than the other. It's just that EOTs are an alternative, not a replacement. And so I like to always think about it as just another buyer at, your table. There are a couple points that I didn't share or didn't highlight in the previous slide. One of them is really just around the cost. So that kind of bottom line of this table, you can see that, the setup cost and the ongoing administration cost is significantly higher with an ESOP. So this might be another reason where at this moment in time for the business, an ESOP may not be the right fit if their financial size just doesn't justify that expense. So we'll often use an estimate if your business is doing less than, say, 2 or 2.5 million in EBITDA. It might be hard to justify the expense relative to the benefit. Again, that's not a hard and fast rule, but we work with a lot of ESOP advisors as well, and they've also kind of given us that sort of floor as it relates to just getting the benefit relative to the cost. So I think, if you're an advisor on the call or if you're advising businesses, think about the EOT as just kind of another tool in your arsenal of things that you can offer. And then if you're an owner, I think, cost aside, the choice really depends on sort of your own goals, your culture, and your capital strategy. Any questions? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. Okay, so we did a little history, told you what the EOT is, how it differs from other ownership structures. I want to share a couple of the misconceptions that we hear a lot. So if you're new to EOTs or maybe even to employee ownership, I think this is probably the slide that I hope stays with you from all of them. So one of the things that we hear, EOTs are only for small businesses. Well, this isn't true. We've actually worked with businesses ranging from 10 to tens of thousands of employees. Employees need to bring cash to become owners. No, this isn't true. It's kind of what they call naked in, naked out. So employees don't have to bring any cash. And at the same time, the company doesn't have to buy them out when they leave. So employees have sort of the right to benefit and participate when they're there. And when they leave, it stops, but the company also doesn't have to buy anything out for them. Owners have to donate shares. No, some owners choose to, but this is by no means a requirement. So these shares can be purchased by the company and financed similar to a traditional buyout. So again, not a concessionary sale here. You can use tools like debt or equity or seller finance to purchase these shares. I've actually got a slide in a couple around the financing, so we can spend more time on that in a few. And then the last thing here, without maybe getting too technical, Matt kind of brought this up earlier. Some states set limits to non-charitable trusts consistent with the statutory rule against perpetuities. So I believe that, Matt would probably know better. We can always confirm this with an attorney too, but I think Vermont actually does have a limit for trust without ascertainable beneficiaries up to 21 years. Yeah. So if we use that, so if that does apply, what that means is basically the nature of the long-term ownership has a fixed term. However, if you establish a trust in a state where this rule does not apply, so for example, we do a lot of our trusts in Delaware, then the long-term indefinite period of that trust can exist. So this is true even if your business operates in Vermont. Setting up a trust in Delaware doesn't have any impact on the jurisdiction of the actual underlying company. So in a way, that's how you can still have a perpetual trust. One of my colleagues let me know there is some legislation being proposed in Vermont that I think is looking at maybe looking to have the perpetual purpose trust. I want to say it's a House Bill VTH 0622 for anybody who's into policy, but I think it's still pretty a long way away from being passed. So right now, our recommendation would be, setting up a trust in a jurisdiction that does allow for PPTs like Delaware. Not having an impact on your company location. And then we'll continue to monitor, progress towards that legislative change. And if it does get passed, then you can look at moving your trust, to Vermont if that was important. Okay. Okay, so who's the right fit? So EOTs, again, with their customizable feature can really fit a wide variety of businesses, business sizes, and industry. So some of the traits and characteristics that we see with owners who ultimately end up choosing this model. So they're really owners that, maybe they want a gradual or partial exit. Obviously, they care about profit sharing. They care about, preserving their culture and really trying to protect sort of long-term independence. Similarly, it's a good fit business if those businesses are ones that have, strong, predictable cash flow. They have an interest in inside sales. They want a simple EO strategy, and they have a workforce that responds well to incentivization. So I think, if you're an owner on the call and you're wondering if this model could be a good fit, if any of these characteristics resonate with you, it'd be something to dive into a bit further. And same with advisors, if you're meeting with clients and you're trying to see who's a good fit, these are some of the traits that I would lean into, besides revenue and number of employees. Okay. So I think probably the easiest way to kind of put this all together is to just kind of go through a case study here. So this is Cypress Valley Meat Company. So they're located in Arkansas. They were a livestock processor for independent farms. So the quote at the bottom is actually from the original founder. It was always his vision that the people he worked with, he would take care of and that they would stay on working with him. Sadly, the founder passed early. So the company was sort of immediately faced with this unplanned succession challenge, as well as needing a plan for growth and stability because this particular industry is quite capital intensive. So you can think farming equipment, it requires a lot of labor, which can eat into the margins. And then the workforce itself had higher turnover and as well as sort of seasonal workers. So the brother of the founder and the CFO got together and they were really kind of trying to figure out what they wanted out of the next iteration of this company, right? And so one of the things they wanted to do was honor their late founder, help preserve and protect the business that he created. They wanted something really simple. They weren't looking to make it overly complicated. And then as much as they wanted to keep, in line with sort of Andy's vision, they also had to deal with the industry realities. So they looked at a couple things. They explored an ESOP, which their CFO actually had a lot of knowledge about and familiarity with. The issue for them, though, they saw the meaningful tax benefits, but the flow of money and the repurchase obligation was in conflict with their specific cash flow needs and strategy. So one of the things with an EOT that is different than other models. So for simplicity, let's say the EOT is 100% owner. The EOT could have 100% right to profit, but not necessarily 100% right to cash flow. And so those principles can be separated. So using this example, this company needed for lack of a better term, like a slush fund of available cash so that they could replace this expensive equipment. So again, tying in sort of ownership correlated to profits, this sort of fund would have been really hard to maintain and grow if they were having to manage against share price volatility or repurchase obligations, and if all profits had to be sort of one-to-one based on ownership. And so this is one of the distinctions of the model, so that it allows the business, really to contextualize for what the business needs while still honoring things like profit share. So in the end, they ended up becoming Arkansas's first EOT, and as well as the first in the meat processing industry. They transitioned in July 2025, and they had about 130, 160 employee owners. So they've since operationalized this model and are already seeing sort of benefits both in performance and the ability to deliver profit sharing. Okay. We're going back in the weeds a little bit. So how do we actually buy out Andy, right, from the previous slide? How do we buy out his shares? There are three kind of options, and these are actually the same options that you would see in like a traditional buyout or an ESOP. So the first is seller finance. So this is in the form of a seller note where the seller is paid gradually for the transition of their ownership. There'll be an agreement with that seller note. It'll have things like, the interest, the payment schedule, what happens if payments are missed, all of those things. The benefit of doing a seller finance deal is, now the company is not taking on any new debt, but at the same time, the seller is also now getting less cash at close. And, it's a risk, but they're also banking on sort of the continued growth and upside of that business. For what it's worth, for all the seller finance deals that we've done, we actually haven't had one that's had a missed payment yet. Okay, so debt finance. So this is where the company would take on a loan, usually from a bank, or could be private credit or a CDFI as well. Right now, EOTs are not eligible for SBA financing. In this case, though, with the debt, so the owner is going to receive the cash on close from the loan proceeds for the shares sold, and then the company is actually responsible for that loan repayment. And then the last sort of option here is this debt and equity finance. I'll admit this is not as mainstream, but we are seeing a few more of these opportunities, a little bit of growth here. So this is where there's some level of an equity sponsor that takes a portion of direct ownership and then is comfortable with sort of patient capital for their returns and eventually recapping their position over time so that their exit is to the trust and that trust ownership grows. So these are options, but these are also not mutually exclusive. So, a lot of times we'll see a combination of A and B, seller finance, debt finance, things like that. I think the other thing to sort of just take away here is the EOT does not put employees in a position to collateralize or hold debt or liability. So, if you're an advisor in the kind of finance world here, I think the takeaways for you are EOTs are typically leveraged, debt service from company cash flow, and seller finance traditionally has been more of the outsized portion, but we are seeing a number of deals now that have a debt component as well. Just gonna give me a second. I'm putting my computer on do not disturb. Okay. Great. Okay. All right, so bear with me. We're going to go a little bit into the mechanics now. So there's a very simple scenario, but first let's set up the EOT. You can do this with a de minimis number of shares or more. So again, it's going to hold those shares on behalf of employees. Then we're going to figure out what combination, from the previous slide works best to buy those shares. So raise the capital and then purchase the shares. The company then is repaying that seller note or repaying the seller note and debt with cash flow alongside some amount of profit sharing, so even if nominally. So we always recommend with the companies that we work with, even in year one, to do some form of profit share, even if it's a really small amount. This makes it much more real. You spend a bunch of time putting this together and talking about it. And so I think it just makes it, again, actualizes it for employees. So now that you've got, your ownership structure, you're trying to now operationalize and really integrate it so that you can start to unlock these performance benefits. And then the final thing here is the flywheel. So, investing in long-term ownership, when you've got your debts paid off, you can increase profit share, you can invest or buy, all while the company, remains independent and doesn't have that pressure of sort of a future sale. So for all the kind of advisors or other service providers on the call, we work with you guys through this whole process. So there's still a role for you here. A lot of times, there's specific areas where you want an advisor or a CPA or a counsel. So I think the big takeaway here is just knowing that this is a structured and disciplined as well as financeable transaction. And it has very similar mechanics to an ESOP or a leverage buyout, just with different governance. Okay. I think this is probably one of my last content slides. I want to do one more case study, and this one's a bit different than the previous one. So Guidon is an Indianapolis-based architecture firm that services both the public and private sectors. It's a team of roughly 90 employees and currently maintains its service-disabled, better-known small business status. So the problem or the challenge with this particular industry, architecture and engineering in general, is it's facing a lot of consolidation and a lot of pressure from private equity. So making it really tough to want to remain and stay independent. This particular leadership group really wanted to safeguard Guidon's legacy and maintain independence, as well as it had a very, very specific interest in increasing the financial benefits for the entire team. So this organization also explored a couple things. So they actually looked at both an ESOP as well as a traditional sale. They had sort of like a checklist of things that were important to them. And as they were going down each of these pathways, both sort of fell short. So with the traditional sale, excuse me, it hardly checked any of what was important. So benefit distribution, governance, aligning with culture, none of that was really meeting the measure that they were hoping. When they did an ESOP, they actually went as far as doing an ESOP feasibility, and it illustrated, potential for strong benefits. But this particular founder happened to also be on an ESOP board and had some concerns or a little skepticism about some of the benefit distribution and share price decision making. So at the same time they were evaluating the ESOP, they actually started looking at the EOT model as well. And so modeling showed that the EOT had the strongest long-term outcomes and was able to deliver on what their priority criteria were. So again, independence, broad-based benefit, transparency. I think there's a few things that are interesting about Guidon's sort of EOT journey. For one, this initially was a gradual transition. So initially the EOT ownership was only partial, and that expected full ownership is going to come over the next 5 years. So the gradual transition is helping to sort of protect the continuity and avoid disruption from that ownership transition, but it also is what allowed Guidon to maintain that service disabled veteran status so they could finish out some of the contracts under that particular status. The other thing that's interesting, so some of the early outcomes for Guidon after this transition, their leadership and day-to-day operations really remained unchanged. From a cultural standpoint, they increased transparency. So employees are now not only beneficiaries of profit sharing, but also of just more information. And then they were really able to keep their sort of long-term priorities intact as they weren't, getting prepared for a sale in the coming years. So for Guidon, years kind of 1, 2, and 3 are really about building this flywheel of shared financial success for their employees. So that's kind of my last bit on EOTs. I just thought it might be useful to understand like why I'm doing this, why our company's doing this. So, we want to build a prosperous and competitive economy using shared ownership. And more specifically, we really want to make employee ownership one of the leading strategies for business owners to transact their business. I mentioned growth in EOTs. This is just limited to our organization, but there's $2 billion in total enterprise value. We've helped create 61,000 new employee owners, and so far we love what we're doing, and I think our customers do too. And so again, just showing that our small little organization is already seeing a lot of EOT growth, and this is what we hope continues across the country. And I think that's it. So Matt, I just want to say again, thank you. We're so appreciative of the Vermont Center for Employee Ownership putting on this webinar and inviting us. Really great for the attendees, any of the service providers on the call. Just thanks for being interested in learning about EOTs. I hope you guys share all of this with anybody who's willing to listen. And this is myself and Sergina's direct contact information is here. So if you want to have a more in-depth conversation or have some specific questions, feel free to reach out to both of us.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise on this. And so for folks who are attending, again, if you want to throw anything in the Q&A, we're happy to dig into any questions you have. I have a few that I would love to get your perspective on, Christina, to sort of start us off here for the more conversational portion. So one thing when I think about the folks who I talk to who are exploring employee ownership and looking at the different options, one of the things that has felt kind of missing has been this question of partial transitions or stage transitions, right? It never happens in the worker co-op world. It used to happen in the ESOP world, and it sometimes still does, but the tax benefits connected to the S corporation ESOP have made it so most deals just go 100% all at once. Can you talk a little bit about what sort of doing a partial EOT to start with looks like, and both kind of what are the challenges, unique challenges and considerations as for business owners thinking about that particular path?
Yeah, great question. So I think there's two kind of contexts that I see a gradual transition happen more frequently. So doing an employee ownership transition, some cases business owners are actually retiring and leaving the business, but others they're actually using it as an operating model. So they're transitioning their business, but the founder or the owners are still planning to work in that business for a number of years. That might be a reason that you do a partial transition, because you as an owner or you as your key leaders are still planning to work. You still have a vested interest and kind of want to maybe safeguard some of that rest of the investment before you eventually leave. Another use case that we see with the partials. So if you've got like a family owned business, and let's say your son or daughter are currently in the business, you go ahead and you want to sell out your portion, but your son and daughter also have, let's say, direct ownership. You maybe they want to hold that longer, but having this partial EOT now means your son and daughter don't have to go through the buy. They don't have to put the business up. They've got an inside buyer already. And so when they're looking to transition out, they can then sell their portion to the EOT too. And so that works out really well. One other use case that we see is, so some of the businesses that we'll work with, I'm sure this applies for folks on the call too, will have maybe a more complicated cap table, or maybe they have a few silent shareholders, silent partners that aren't really operationally in the business. Doing a partial transition would allow you to sort of buy out those silent shareholders, give them some liquidity, give them something for their honest dollars that they participated in, let you clean up kind of that sort of capitalization table, simplify the shareholders so that when you go to make another decision or a bigger transition down the road, you're only kind of dealing with maybe one or two parties instead of the 4 or 5 that you had previously with those silent shareholders. So that's another version that we've seen where the partial is used. I think, I don't know if there's a ton of challenges. I think the one thing just to remember is you're doing a partial. And so if your plan and intention is to do 100%, you're going to need to go through and do a secondary sort of sale again. So a lot of some of the things you do around the transaction diligence, around getting evaluation, around doing all of that, you'll need to do it again when you go to sell the second time. So just, keeping in mind that that's going to be part of that next process. Again, just because you did it for the partial doesn't mean that it's exactly going to work for the next portion.
Great, great. And we've got some really good questions from folks coming in. So the first one here is, how employees get value? Is the company still a taxable entity?
Tax, man. I feel like that's everybody's favorite question. So my answer on tax is always that it sort of depends. There's variation in both how the company tax election is, the timing of the transaction, and actually the trust type itself. So those are some of the influencing factors. What we do typically when we can, and because trusts face a higher tax uh, percentage, is that if we think about the profit share as either a dividend or an outsized bonus, we'll have that done at the company level so that it's not faced with that double taxation and it's only on income. And so that's a way to help keep taxes sort of optimized. Speak from our process, we have a lot of different strategies that we'll employ to try to optimize for tax. We're always going to also recommend that you consult or work with your CPA to go through some of this, but there's a few different sort of levers that we can look at, just depending again on what you're trying to optimize for.
All right, and then the other piece, which Janine also had kind of a second question that I think this is related, was around kind of how do employees get value, and then the other question was how do employees enter the trust or start to get shares.
Yeah. I'll start with the second one and then kind of go up to the value one. So, reminder, with this model, there are no individual shares. So when an employee ownership trust is set up, the owner or whoever's helping sort of with the creation of this is actually designing and articulating through the trust and some of the operating agreements how they want participation and eligibility to look. So I'll use an example where, like, a hospitality business that we worked with. So what's great about the model with the EOT is because eligibility isn't defined within the Department of Labor, you can include different worker groups. So it doesn't mean that every one of your colleagues has to be a W-2. So a lot of the hospitality business that we work with has a lot of seasonal workforce as well, but they wanted them to be able to participate. And so for that particular business, they were crafting their sort of profit share, their benefit based on, okay, are you a full-time, employee at this company? You're going to be sort of eligible, have this amount of profit share. We still want to reward our seasonal workforce. It's going to look a little bit different, just again, by the nature of how much time they're spending at the company. So there's not a prescribed like number of hours the way it is for sort of a W-2 calculation, I think within the ESOP model, but that sort of definition and when it starts is really kind of determined at the onset. And then that can be amended, of course, as needed, but that would be stipulated, again, at the beginning. So really kind of up to the owner discretion there. In terms of the value, so one, there's the value, right, of just getting more in terms of performance, getting more wage, real-time benefit. The other is in sort of voice and participation. So the governance of the trust itself, there's opportunities for employees to sit on, it's called the Trust Stewardship Committee. And that in a way is giving that employee voice, that employee seat to helping protect and preserve some of what the purpose of the trust was set up for.
So one little bit of additional context I'm curious on this question before we move on to the next one. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Is that, again, looking at the sort of the most common forms of employee ownership, one of the big differences between an ESOP and a worker co-op is that with a worker co-op, basically, there's no exposure to the valuation of the company on the part of the employee owners. It's all kind of profit share. With the ESOP, although ESOPs technically can make dividends, I've yet to encounter one that does. So all of the value is delivered through the market value of the company of the shares, kind of retirement plan. So there's like, and critics of both of each model might say, okay, the worker co-op, because it's purely profit based, is a little bit short-sighted, and the ESOP is like, okay, for 23-year-old employee owner, it's hard to sort of see that long time frame. My sense is that the EOT kind of lands, with its kind of profit share with the shares in the trust, lands more on the sort of the worker co-op side of things with the profit the profit share being the primary thing. But I also know, I remember reading something from like Corey Rosen from NCEO talking about how, you could do things like have some exposure to the value of the company through things like phantom stock or other things like that. Have you seen anything along those lines in companies you've worked with?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. A couple of things there. I think uh, the way that you put like ESOPs and co-ops, I actually think the trust is almost somewhere in the middle in the sense that you know the exposure to the share price is not direct in the share, but it is if the company's increasing in profitability and able to pay off debts and everything like that. That should also translate and correlate to investment both into the business, but also to the employees in the form of increasing that profit share or the frequency or things like that. So there's going to be a net win if the company is, doing really well. But absolutely. So so a couple of the companies that we've worked with have like more of a traditional management incentive plan that'll go alongside an EOT. So you'll have a broad-based ownership structure, but then you also might further incentivize, again, maybe the next president, maybe the next sort of leader that's taking over. One, to keep it competitive if you really also need them, but also because it's an option available. And so for companies that are kind of multi-tracking this, so if you're looking at that private exit and you're also considering this, in that traditional private exit, you're going to frequently see things like management incentive plans or otherwise. You can also mirror those same with an EOT exit too.
All right, so let's get into Frank's questions here. He asks, please explain governance and leadership responsibility in more detail, and how much will the original owner still be in charge of running the company?
Mhm. Uh, Great questions, Frank. And I feel like these might warrant also a deeper dive, but at the kind of very high level. So the trust itself is governed by what I just mentioned as a trust stewardship committee. So the trust stewardship committee, most often that we've seen has maybe an exiting founder, maybe then sort of manager and leader, and then also that employee seat. The other sort of participant on that is what's called the trust enforcer or the trust protector. That role is simply to act as sort of a mediator between the company and the trust, should there be any grievances. So they're able to kind of file them internally and sort of protect the trust against any sort of lawsuit. Relative to the sort of ongoing leadership of the owner, I think so I'll say this, it depends, right? Because if you have an owner, you can have an owner who is economically 100% out, but operationally still in, right? So the example of using EOTs as an operating model, your CEO or your original owner might still be working in that business, but their ownership value in that sense, they've already sort of cashed out, so to speak, right? If most of these employee ownership sort of transitions require having sort of successive leadership kind of in place or at least identified. So another value of that gradual exit, if your sort of succession team isn't quite ready yet, you can use that gradual exit as a way to get them trained and get them ready to go. So I guess it kind of depends on what the owner is actually doing. If the owner's intention is to retire, go hang out with grandkids, go hang out on a beach, whatever it is, presumably they have put in place that next succession leadership so that they can be out of the business. If they wanted a role and they wanted to have some sort of insight, they can sit on the trust stewardship committee. In that case, it's very similar like having a board or something like that. So they're there, they have a little bit of a connection to the business, but they're really not doing anything day to day. So the trust stewardship committee itself is not going to be responsible for company strategy, for company hiring. All of that's still going to live at the management level. The trust stewardship committee really is almost like I said, almost like a board, sort of existential. What the trust stewardship committee is going to get involved in are things like a sale or a merger, dissolution of the company, termination of the trust, anything that might dilute that trust ownership. And then again, depending on how the company is structured, if they had a board, maybe they would weigh in on approval of board members. But again, really speaking, the day-to-day, the company level decisions are all being made at the company, and that trust is really there just as to make sure that the sort of things that were protected in the trust are still holding true with the company. that helps.
All right. So our next question is from Kathy. How do EOTs work with startups as opposed to succession sales? How do they work with LLCs? And do profits flow through the trust to employees, or does profit sharing flow directly to the employees by virtue of a requirement in the trust document itself?
Yeah, great question. So I'll start with the last one. It depends on that one, on the profit sharing and how the flow of funds. It depends on how you set the trust up. What I mentioned earlier is what we try to do as most often as we can have that profit share administered at the company level through like a payroll or a dividend or something like that, so that you're not dealing with the taxation issue of the trust as well. The trust document itself. So one thing about the trust is it's really a protective mechanism. It's not a prescriptive one. So what the trust will say is, one of the purposes of the company is to make sure our employees, continue to see increased wages and things like that. And so we're going to offer a profit, but the actual how it works, how it's doled out, and the percentages, that's all being done and defined sort of at that company level, which again gives you that flexibility if you have a really big year and you want to increase it, if you've got a tight year and you need to kind of ratchet a little bit back. By having it at the company level, you're able to do that. So in terms of EOTs, so we've worked with all sort of tax elections, S corps, C corps, LLCs, things like that. Through like the process that we use, we'll look at the current election and figure out, depending on what you're trying to do, depending on the type of trust that you set up, grantor, non-grantor, things like that, there may be a reason or a benefit to changing that tax election, but there's nothing that technically makes it not able to do if you're like an LLC. In terms of startups, I guess it would depend how you're defining a startup. What's generally true for all of these transactions, and I think this is true with really an ESOP and some of the employee ownership models as well, is you kind of need to be a profitable company to kind of take this step. And why I say that is because the financial health, it needs to be strong so that if you're doing things like a profit share, you're actually able to do so and you're not putting an undue stress on the company. Usually when we work with businesses, if there are any concerns about growth, or they're in a big rebuild year or something like that, and it doesn't feel like they're maybe financially ready to need this much structure, there's a lot of things you can do to sort of set your culture up for that eventual transition. So you could do a profit share plan now. You could start to increase your employee voice through employee committees or decision making, sort of laying the foundation for what that eventual transition would look like. Frankly, and with a startup, again, I guess if you don't have a ton of employees either, doing a broad-based solution might be, again, overly complicated for what you really need to do. But there's some foundational work that you can start, both culturally and otherwise, to kind of build your roadmap towards this transition.
All right. So quick follow-up from Frank. Who hires and fires the CEO?
Yeah, great question. That's going to depend. So it'll depend on your company structure, right? So if let's say you were a C corp and you had a board of directors, that board is still going to oversee management, right? So they'd probably still have a role in that particular CEO hire. I think if you're not a company that doesn't, that's where part of that initial trust formation and what you're defining that the trust gets involved in could be stipulated that that's a position where the trust stewardship committee would want to have some say in. So it depends a little bit on the formation of the company.
All right. So Cliff has a question. Are any personal guarantees required when a lender or bank is involved in the purchase?
Great question. So Sergina actually on the call manages all of our lender relationships, but it's a great question. A lot of banks, are going to look at that. What we've tried to do in building out our relationships with different lenders is to see where they have flexibility in easing that up, because that is a concern for many of the business owners. So of the lenders that, we've worked with and we would kind of go to bring a deal, we're really leaning into the ones that kind of remove that or have flexibility to remove that. if your business is really asset heavy or something like that, some of the banks also may look at switching and using like more collateralized loan because you've got equipment or real estate or something like that that they can use instead of a personal guarantee. But it is going to be bank specific, right? And they're going to look at each deal by deal and underwrite it differently. And so depending how they look at it, they may or may not be willing to lift that. So Gina, do you want to add anything as it relates to personal guarantees?
Yeah, I think you covered it pretty well, and I think that it also maybe slightly depends on if the seller, how much the seller is staying on versus fully exiting. Where maybe like they are more open to taking on personal guarantee if they are still pretty involved. But as Christina said, we seek to build lending relationships where they can ease off on the personal guarantee.
All right, and then Janine had a follow-up question. The employees get value from the EOT through an annual profit share dividend, correct? Is it determined by percentage of wages by job title or department when the EOT is established? And then what
Yep,
about for
great
the
question.
MIP plan? Are
Um,
those usually based on KPIs or something not on the value of the company?
Yeah. So on the first one, that profit share, so that there's a lot of variation there. So we'll help the company if they haven't sort of defined how they want to do profit sharing, but it can be things like percentage of payroll, it can be annual dividend, it can be like more of a profit payout. There's various ways to set up your profit sharing program, just depending on what the company really wants to do. Um, the wages and title, again, when we think about the profit or benefit tiers at the onset, when an owner is thinking about creating this trust and creating this plan, that's where you'd actually start to stipulate some of that. If title and things like that was a determining factor for you, you could decide to do that. uh the management incentive plans, yeah, I think they some of them are KPI based. I think Sergina, do you want to speak to any of the management incentive plans that we've seen with some of the deals that you've worked on?
Yeah, like we structure it so that let's say for the executive team, C-suite or senior managers that there is more of like let's say a performance incentive that is kind of differentiated from the broad-based profit sharing plan. So this is like let's say there's certain growth targets or profitability measures. It keeps the management team more aligned about like future strategic opportunity while still like the whole company being aligned to the kind of high level budget and targets and then having access to profit sharing. But that is a case where we could see that the profit sharing for broad-based employees and management may look slightly different.
We
You're
we are
muted,
at
Matt.
we are at 1 o'clock, but nice question. Last question's a nice little final tee up to for you all in terms of what role do you play in the process? If you can answer that in 15
Oh,
seconds.
in 15 seconds. Yeah. So we are a soup to nuts operator. So we'll help an organization go through the planning, and then we also help with the design and implementation of the trust. So really sort of quarterbacking all of the process components in that sort of first and second phase, whether that's capital coordination, stakeholder involvement, transaction diligence. We're sort of we're project managing all of that and project managing that close process. And so, we've got a trust artifact. We're not attorneys, so we'll always say, "Hey, go have this reviewed by an attorney." We obviously have a bunch that we've worked with that have looked at these, but the point being, we have an artifact, so your attorney should not start something from scratch, or you have to go build this yourself. So we'll really help all those things we talked about earlier: profit sharing, trust stewardship committee, purpose statements. All of that is kind of within our process that we do within sort of different modules, almost like working sessions. So we'll actually work with an owner and go through and help you create these. So it's not leaving you off into the wilderness to go define your purpose statements. But if you have them, awesome. But if you want help, we can help too.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share your experience with our community. This has been great, and thank you to everyone who came and asked really good questions. This has been a fun conversation for me. So, any final thought before I stop the recording here?
No, I was going to say the same. Really appreciate all the thoughtful questions. If you feel like I didn't answer you in depth enough or you had other ones, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to set some time up and talk further.